Hi Year 10, welcome to this week's episode of your English Literature podcast. With you today you have Miss Beaumont,
Mr. Rafi,
and Miss Hussain.
And we're talking to you today about the poem Winter Swans by Owen Shears. So before you listen to the rest of this podcast, you need to make sure that you've got the poem in front of you, and you need to make sure that you've read through it yourself first, please. So if you need to now, take a moment to pause this podcast and go and get everything that you need. Okay, good. So we're going to start by talking about each stanza in the poem and about what's happening in the poem. So we've got an overview of what the poem is about by the end. So I'll start off. In the first stanza of the poem, we can see that it's raining and we've got two people who are walking. We don't know where yet, but they've gone for a walk together.
Okay, we know that, like we just said, it's been raining, so the earth is waterlogged. There's a lot of rain on the ground, and the two people that are walking together, they're walking silently and apart, so they're not walking with each other, they're not having a conversation, so something's wrong.
And they're walking past a lake where they both see swans with their heads underwater.
And in the fourth stanza, the poet goes on to describe what these swans look like, and uses a couple of metaphors and a simile to describe those. So we'll come back and look at those in a bit more detail in a second.
In the next stanza, one of them, I'm guessing it's the woman out of the two, says they mate for life. So they're talking about the swans still, but the other person, the man, he didn't reply and they carried on walking. So there's a problem, they're not having a proper conversation.
The next stanza, it's about either the two swans or the couple coming together and their hands reaching out for one another.
And we can see in the last stanza, it talks about how the hands fold one over the other like a pair of wings. So the two people have reached out and have held hands with each other as well. So we can see throughout the poem that we've started off very, very negatively, and it's actually moved to become much more positive by the end of the poem, and quite optimistic maybe about this relationship and where this relationship's going. So to start off, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the poet Owen Shears. We don't know a lot about this poem's background, not as much as we know about some of the poems, but I can tell you that Owen Shears is a poet who is still alive. He's a modern poet and he's from Wales, and he writes a lot about nature. And if you've ever been to Wales, you'll know that it's a very beautiful country with lots of mountains, lots of green fields, lots of rain and lakes. So perhaps he wrote this poem with that natural landscape that he grew up in mind. So that's just something to bear in mind. So should we start by talking a little bit about the similes and metaphors in the fourth stanza, because that's something that really stood out to me. What could we perhaps talk about in terms of these swans and how they're being described?
Okay, so on the first of those three lines in the fourth stanza, we can see that he's used the words dark water, so we can see that could be a metaphor for something bad, something negative. It could be a metaphor for the physical water. They could also be talking about their relationships, or something's happened. We might not be just talking about the swans, but something to do with the couple, perhaps a breakup or an argument or some sort of issue that they're going through. So you've got dark water.
And just after that as well, on the second line, we've got the swans are described as icebergs of white feather. So when I think about an iceberg, I know that it's obviously a big body of ice, it's in the water, and the thing that is most famous probably about icebergs is that most of an iceberg is underwater. You can't see all of it, only a tiny, tiny proportion is above the surface. So that reinforces what Mr. Rafi just said, and the idea that there's perhaps a lot going on in between this couple, between these two people by the lake. There's a lot below the surface that we don't know about their relationship, that perhaps they don't want to talk about. What else could we say? So we've got a simile in that stanza as well.
Yeah.
The swans are dipping underwater, but then they come back to the surface again, and the writer says, he uses the simile, like boats writing in rough weather. So that gives me the image of it's really stormy, the boats are getting thrown from left to right, but they're coming and stabilising to a complete standstill again. So how could we, what does that tell us perhaps about their relationship, if that's the metaphor, the simile, sorry, that the writer's using?
The relationship is, they're going through a lot in their relationship. There's a lot of problems, but they're trying to combat that by showing unity and staying together, staying strong.
So again, that's quite hopeful, isn't it? That's what we were saying about this poem, and overall, it does get more hopeful as we go through. So there's a couple of things that we could talk about in terms of language. The structure of the poem obviously is something that we need to talk about as well. So we want to think about things like the overall shape of the poem, whether the writer's used any white space, the use of punctuation possibly. So who'd like to start us off talking about structure? What could we say?
Well, if you turn the poem onto its side, you can see how the lines are not all the same length, and the longest lines are in the middle, and it kind of resembles an iceberg.
So again, the shape of the poem is something that we could talk about in a structure answer, in a structure paragraph, thinking about how the overall shape possibly reflects this idea that there's lots going on in this relationship. And you could also think about icebergs themselves as being things that are very cold, very hard, very fragile. They're all quite negative things to associate with a relationship and with feelings as well. So you could go even further if you're aiming for a higher grade and explore the connotations of iceberg and of ice as well.
Also, line 11, which is the middle of the poem, it's the longest line, and maybe that's where most of the tension is, where the climax of the poem is.
Yeah, because when you turn it on its side, it does look a bit like a Freytag's pyramid, doesn't it? It looks like an overall structure of a narrative. So we've almost got that climax in the middle, and we've got that nice resolution at the end there, where the couple hold hands, and it's like their relationship is going to mend, and we get that hopeful feeling.
Yeah, with that ending, we see this full stop right at the end, so we understand that there's no more to the poem, the story, or the problems perhaps. So now that they've somehow recovered from their problem, they've finally found some sort of peace or some sort of balance, and now they're happy together again. So they're holding hands and everything's okay now, and we end it on a positive note.
So there's lots of themes that we've mentioned so far that we could talk about, and we could certainly remember it's really important to think about themes because they help us to link the poems together and think about what poems sort of fit well with other poems. Distance is obviously a theme that we have focused on a lot recently because lots of the poems are about distance, whether that's a physical distance between two people or an emotional distance, so a distance in feelings and the way people feel about each other. So definitely this poem, I think, is a really good example of that. It mentions distance in the second to last stanza. The word is there. And we've also got a bit of a gap between that second to last stanza and the last one as well. So we've got maybe a physical distance there as well. Any other themes that would be good for us to link to some of the poems?
The more obvious one that we've probably picked out already is the theme of nature. So we see a lot of natural imagery. We can see the lake, the swans, the weather, all these different things that the poet uses to describe and show the different emotions and feelings come across through the speaker and through the people that are being talked about.
Definitely. And if we're thinking about what poems could we link this to, there's lots of poems that talk about nature and distance, aren't there? So neutral tones would be a really good one. In neutral tones, again, there's lots of quite complicated feelings about the end of a relationship. Much less hopeful than this poem, Neutral Tones. Neutral Tones, it definitely seems like the relationship is over, whereas in this poem, it looks like they might get back together or they might join back up again. But the use of imagery of water and nature would be really good things to comment on in both poems. Are there any other poems that immediately jump out at us as a good fit for this one?
I think Eden Rock would be a good one to compare to, especially looking at the theme of separation and trying to unite again. So in Eden Rock, the son trying to get to his parents past the stream. So that stream of water is between the two, and it's keeping them apart. And then same in this one here, we've got the lake and the two people coming together across the lake.
So before you finish today, have a think about which other poems in the anthology might be a good fit, because those aren't the only two poems that might fit well with this one. You might be able to think of your own, and remember, as long as you can draw some similarities and differences between the poems and you can compare them, then you can compare any poems in the anthology that you want to. So with that in mind, thank you very much for listening today, and join us next week when we'll be talking about our next poem in the anthology. But for now, goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.